Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important conversation on advancing opportunity and equity in the time of COVID. This event, which is live here on Facebook and will be posted on, live here on Zoom and will be posted on Facebook after the fact, is the first opportunity of many to engage with the Community Foundation as they work to realize the goals listed in the Stepping Forward commitment. My name is Mercy Quay. I'm the founder and principal consultant of the Narrative Project, Connecticut's only anti-racist and social justice communications agency. We connect and communicate just missions. The TMP team will be collecting questions in the chat room and engaging on social media, so please do not hesitate to reach out and ask your questions. Before we start today's conversation, just a few pieces of housekeeping. First, all participants are muted to keep the quality of the audio as smooth as possible. If time permits, we will be holding space for a Q&A session at the end, but even if we do run out of time, we'll be gathering questions for engagement opportunities at a later date. If for any reason we are disconnected due to inclement weather or power outages, we will reach out to you with a rescheduled date. At the end of tonight's conversation, you will be prompted to take a survey. So please take a moment and tell us what you thought of tonight's event. And then finally, please be sure to join the conversation on social media using hashtag #SteppingForwardGNH. In a moment, I'll be passing it over to Community Foundation Board Chair and retired State Supreme Court Justice Nick Norcott, who will be giving us some opening remarks. But before I do, a bit about our panelists. Moderating tonight's conversation is Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, reporter covering education, housing, and inequality for the Connecticut Mirror. And our panelists include regional and national experts in health, business, entrepreneurship, youth organizing, housing, education, and disparities. Tonight, we will be hearing from Dr. Kalila Brown-Dean, Addis Castillo, Will Ginsburg, Dr. Marcella Nunes-Smith, Onika Obiocha, and Garrett Sheehan. And for the sake of time, please feel free to visit cfgnh.org/steppingforward to view each of their full bios. Now, without any further delay, please welcome Community Foundation Board Chair, Nick Norcott.
Good evening. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven, I welcome you to what I'm sure is going to be an exciting and informative session on the Foundation's Stepping Forward initiative. You'll hear from an incredibly distinguished panel and from our President and CEO, Will Ginsburg, who will set the stage for a series of future conversations in which we want to involve each and every one of you. One of our very talented staff members described this forum, the hope for this forum, as follows: a listening and engagement event as much as a way to share with the community the commitment we have made. How apt. The core elements of Stepping Forward address the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and also the continuing pandemic of racial inequities. Stepping Forward is about change. While this is a new programmatic move, it does not mean that we've abandoned our traditional fiduciary responsibilities or our commitment to our nonprofit community. Change can be good, but change can also be bad. The late iconic Congressman John Lewis invited us to engage in good trouble. I say let's engage in good change, as I encourage you to join us in our ambitious endeavor. Stay safe, and now let me introduce to you and welcome our moderator for today's program, Jacqueline Rabe Thomas from the Connecticut Mirror. Thanks.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stepping Forward, Advancing Opportunity and Equity during the time of COVID. We're going to start off with a question for Will to just talk about what is Stepping Forward? What do you hope to accomplish? And what is the initiative that we're all gathered here to talk about?
Thank you, Jackie and Nick. Thank you for those remarks, and good evening to everybody. Stepping Forward is a commitment, as you've just heard. It's the Community Foundation's response to the extraordinary moment we're in as a community, indeed as a country, and the extraordinary circumstances that are facing our community today. That starts with the tremendous need that's been created by COVID. The huge social and economic dislocation and devastation that's been caused by COVID. We have a nonprofit sector in Greater New Haven that's facing existential threats. And we have vastly increased numbers of our neighbors and friends, local residents who are vulnerable today to hunger and eviction and suffering than was true a year ago at this time or in years past. And we've seen through COVID a tremendously disparate impact, with people of color disparately impacted much worse than the general population, and where the racial and ethnic and gender gaps in our society and in our community have been widened substantially. This is also not only a time of need, this is a time of change, as Nick said. There's a strong sense that's been produced by COVID that the systems and structures that we've relied on have been unable to cope with the challenges of this time. The racial disparities, as I mentioned, is perhaps the best evidence of that. And on top of that, we've seen this tremendous, we saw this tremendous surge in 2020 of anti-Black violence, the tragedies that occurred in other communities around the country, in Minneapolis and in Louisville and in Georgia and in other places. And from that has come tremendous new energy. New leaders have emerged, new ideas have emerged, new energy has emerged, new commitments to address the longstanding scourge of our society of racial inequity. So we feel that this is a time of opportunity as well as a time of need, a time when change is in the wind and the forces of change seem to have the wind at their back. So stepping forward is about not only supporting the service providers in our community to address needs, it's about supporting the change makers in our community to make change at this moment. Stepping forward is about greater spending by the Community Foundation, certainly. It's a $26 million initiative over the next 3 years, $15 million in additional current use spending. And I emphasize the word additional to underscore the point that Nick Norcutt made, which is that this is not moving away from our traditional ways of doing business, it's adding to them. And $11 million in new endowments that we've set up to address the issues of COVID-19 and racial equity. It's unprecedented for the Community Foundation in terms of the spending levels and the draw on our endowments that have been built for 93 years by generous people in this community so that we could respond when the needs and opportunities demanded it. And that's what we're doing. It's unprecedented in the sense of a campaign, launching a campaign to raise new monies for these issues. It's unprecedented in the major increases in our traditional grant-making programs and in all the ways that we are undertaking new ways of supporting our community, new grant-making programs. And these are, I can talk more about these, but these are outlined in detail on our website. And as I said, I can talk more about that. Stepping forward will reach the community both very broadly and very deeply. All 20 of our towns, including the 5 towns in the lower Naugatuck Valley, where we're partnering with our affiliate Valley Community Foundation. And we will reach the community more deeply through outreach and listening. These dynamics that I'm talking about, COVID and race, are changing constantly. And we need to understand those changes so we can respond as effectively as possible to them over the 3 years of stepping forward. So we need to reach deeply into our community to listen and to understand from people who are on the front lines of these issues how best we can support them. So that's a very important part of stepping forward as well. And we want to hear from all of you, not only tonight, but on an ongoing basis. I do want to say that in 2019, our board at that time, Kalila Brown-Dean, who's on the panel tonight, was our board chair, adopted a 5-year strategic plan where we made the commitment over the next 5 years to focus on opportunity and equity, envisioning that Greater New Haven could become a community of greater opportunity and greater equity. Today, in light of all that's happened over the last year, we believe that to realize this vision and to move it forward, the priorities have to be addressing the impacts of COVID and advancing racial equity. And that's what stepping forward is about. And the last thing I would say is that we believe the whole community needs to step forward. Indeed, the whole community has been stepping forward. We've seen nonprofits stepping forward under the most difficult circumstances over the last year. We've seen donors stepping forward in a fantastic way. Think about our healthcare institutions and the way they've stepped forward. So when I say the whole community needs to step forward, I'm very mindful of all that is happening in our community. But to understand the dynamics that are reshaping our community, to understand them in a way that we can turn them in our favor, and to step forward to meet the challenges of our time requires the entire community to do so. And we want to work with all of you over the next 3 years as we implement Stepping Forward. So I would conclude simply by thanking our panelists for joining us tonight, thanking you, Jackie, for moderating, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great. And so with that, let's start with the context of the community and sort of what we're seeing in Greater New Haven, and what does the face of inequity in Greater New Haven look like? What are some of the root causes that are out there that you think need to be addressed? Addis, do you wanna begin?
Whoa, okay, loaded question. So I'm gonna start by saying that, but I can't help but after hearing William Ginsburg say what he said, that while we're looking at what the face of inequity looks like, I also think we would be remiss to say that it's not just about what you see in the community, but also how this manifests itself within institutions that hold power, like the Community Foundation, like Yale, like some of the other conglomerates that are in the city. So while the problems look like they are usually multiracial, intergenerational, is all economic, is definitely multicultural. There's something that's being missed right now. And that is, while there seems to be funding available to do direct service, there's an opportunity being missed from those of us who are receiving the service. Those of us who do the work in the community have a bird's eye view of what that work looks like. What I'm more interested in, even in this moment while we have this audience here, is figuring out how people are actually internalizing the work. It's not just about giving dollars to the issues that are at hand and wanting to support the work that's happening in the community, but ultimately the power structures need to also internalize this work. A lot of folks are giving money to the issue, but not people are doing the work. Even the work of racial equity, let's be honest, this is not like a 3-year commitment. This has to be a long-term shifting narrative that would actually take root, not just in the practice of the foundation, but also in the practice in the giving across the country. How are people funding revolution? We can't expect programs and philanthropy to all save us from these issues. The issues that we're talking about are not just about economics. They're actually rooted in historic racism that's manifesting not just in our policies that impact families, but also in the way that our institutions operate, even in the way that grants are given out. So while I'm just going to leave it with that, saying that, yeah, we know what the front line looks like as far as these issues. I don't have to keep telling you that, but I would urge anyone who's sitting here having this conversation and looking to contribute to the pot to start thinking about not just your dollars have to be invested, but your heart needs to be invested. This is work that you should be doing for yourself internally. Racial equity work is not just about diversifying the workforce or who's getting access. It's also about us dismantling our own internalized racism and the way that racism is manifesting in the systems that we're operating in.
I see. Kalila, do you want to weigh in on that question about how inequality is showing up in communities and sort of next steps forward that you think would be great?
Sure, and thank you so much for the opportunity. One of the things that I think is so important, it is not lost on me that we're having this conversation on the first day of Black History Month, because that requires a reckoning. And I've been thinking a lot about the work of James Baldwin in this moment, who says everything that is faced cannot be fixed, but you cannot fix what you don't face. And so while many people were surprised about the disparities related to COVID-19 and the documented disparities that were leading to the uprisings that we were seeing across the country and here in New Haven, for people who experience that every day, it wasn't new. It wasn't new to know that families work very hard, contribute to the tax base, and still don't have enough income to ensure they have their basic needs. And so while people were shocked and surprised by that, it was a moment to step back and say, look, what do we need to do? But more importantly, to whom should we be listening to direct that work? Marcella and Nick and I served on a joint committee between the Community Foundation and the United Way. And what was very clear in that work was that we could not continue to do work as we had always done. It required new ways of doing business to understand that when people are out there guaranteeing that families have a safe place for their children to go because they are frontline workers who don't have the luxury of working remotely, then how can we expedite that process so that bureaucracy doesn't get in the way of service providers getting the money that they need to keep their programs going? And so the deep-seated disparities that we were seeing in terms of the impact of these dual pandemics did not happen overnight. And I think, as Ada said, will not be addressed overnight. And so what needs to happen then, in terms of what we were seeing and what we also realized, is that you have to acknowledge your place in that power structure, but be willing to humble yourself to listen to those who say this is the difference that needs to be made. What does that mean? It meant that we started having conversations, building relationships, and funding organizations like mutual aid societies who could take $500 and flip that into supporting 12 families in a way that some other organizations were not nimble enough to do that. And so all of that then means that, in terms of what we're seeing on every indicator of wellness for this region, the question to be asked is why? Why did we see certain children who attend schools not being able to get access to education, not just for standardized tests, but because for many kids, home was not a safe place for them? And so that is the learning that has happened. That is the learning that has to continue to happen. And I think what is so important, we have to reject this notion of cultural competency that, now I can identify a problem, and so now I've done the work, but instead embrace what others, health educators and others, have called cultural humility, to understand we don't have all the answers. We don't have to invite people into our space and to our table, but be humble enough to ask to start that relationship.
Next, go to Garrett to talk a little bit about the role that the business community can potentially play in this conversation and what the business community in Greater New Haven sees as the inequalities that need to be addressed.
And thanks, Jackie, and thanks for having me on this panel. Well, I mean, the first thing I just want to say is that I being on this panel with so many other really smart people on this topic, I mean, I definitely come at this that I'm not an expert, and the chamber is not an expert. We're here as learners, and that we need to learn things and learn to make changes. And that's really what the last several months have been for us, but having that commitment to step forward. And just listening here tonight, some of the things that stood out to me, I mean, one of the changes that we've kind of tried to internalize at the chamber is we used to always just kind of think of things in the business lane, is that a business issue? And for us really to be a much stronger organization, we can't lock ourselves into that lane and just say, oh, that's a business issue, so we're only going to stick to the business topics. So that means venturing out into other areas, whether it's housing, education, being willing to have those conversations and take a stand. Dig deeper and take action, and that goes for businesses across the board. That it's probably been said a million times, and it's a wrong statement, but someone will say, well, I can't find, qualified minority candidates for this position. Well, that's not an ending point. That's a starting point. And that means you need to dig deeper and look for more people that you can give a chance and move up the pipeline overall. Don't do it alone. I'm coming up on 3 years at the chamber, and this was a focus for the chamber when I first came into my position, but the chamber just going out to work with other communities in Greater New Haven is not going to get it done. We need to work with the people that are already on the ground. We're, like I said at the beginning, not the experts by any means. So we've tried to deepen our partnerships that we have with other organizations, and that's still an ongoing process that we're working on. And just being more intentional and holding people accountable to actually taking action And the last thing, and Ada said this, I mean, this is a long-term commitment. This is not going to be, what did you do in 2020? What were the great goals you set up in 2021? This is a multi-year process. And the focus and the attention has been here for the last 6 months, but we need to make sure that that stays there beyond this. Because one of the things in business that always happens, especially our small businesses, they're just trying to keep up with their business. We've definitely seen that as we've gone through the pandemic. A 1-person, 3-person, 10-person small business, they're struggling to make it every day. Maybe they're being successful, but they're completely devoting themselves. So taking time and to have awareness of our surroundings and how we can be intentional about making change.
I'd like to next go to Marcela Nunez-Smith. COVID has caused a lot of health inequality going on and brought it to light for many people, a situation that many on this panel know had long existed. I'm curious what your thoughts are as far as what does health inequality look like in the greater New Haven area, and what are some opportunities for change?
Well, let me just add my thanks for being part of this very esteemed panel, and to have this critical conversation this evening to certainly get it started. I'm a practicing internal medicine physician and have been for 20 years. And part of the work that I've done as a researcher has been to say, we as healthcare systems have to be in the self-interrogation business a little bit more often. This, I think when we talk about the pandemic, if nothing else, now we should all be able to name the many forces that have come together to result in the inequities that we see today. At the top of the panel, we'll share the very, very grim statistics. We, unfortunately, many of the people in the audience and on the panel tonight could have predicted the communities that would be hardest hit from COVID-19, right? And so moving forward, our obligation and commitment has to be to disrupt the predictability of that pattern, whether we're talking about here in New Haven or beyond. I think kind of two perspectives I would add. One is kind of where the responsibility around healthcare specifically is and healthcare delivery systems and the work that we need to do there. We conducted early surveys around what were expectations of people of color vis-a-vis the healthcare system in COVID-19. And what we saw was maybe not surprising, but really a call for action, where respondents of color to the survey said that this is overwhelming majority, said, we are pretty confident that we would not get the same care, right, coming into the hospital for COVID-19 as white patients would get. We are pretty confident that we would not be offered the same life-saving therapies and treatments as white patients would. And at the time we did that survey, there were many questions and suspicion, right, sort of skepticism about that. But sadly, the data bore that out and supported that. And so we have to be able to name the bias that people have experienced, right? A lot of my work now is talking about things like Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks and very, very dark, ugly moments in our history of medical experimentation. But not everyone needs to look back that far, right? People have experiences from this week, this month, right? Seeking care. So how do we get ahead of that? That is our responsibility. But also this bigger conceptualization of what health is, right? Because let us not think health is just healthcare, and healthcare delivery is what we're talking about tonight, all these structural social drivers of wellness and equity that really are the things that we need to address head on if we're going to see any differences in terms of health outcomes for our communities moving forward. So I could go on all night on these topics. I will pause there, and I'm just also very trying to take words from everybody else and trying to be humble in this moment and try to listen even as we reckon with these realities. So thank you.
Next, we'll go to Anika. I wanted to just ask you, so we talked a little bit about health inequities and how they present themselves. I'm curious about some of the other inequities that are presenting themselves and sort of setting the landscape for things that need to be improved for greater New Haven residents.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, there are, and first off, before I begin again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I think this is a conversation that needs to be had. And to be one of the many voices in the room is I'm deeply humbled and grateful. So I think in terms of other inequities, especially when you're thinking about Black and Brown Indigenous communities, it's been a confluence of hundreds and hundreds of years of disinvestment and not enough resources to really realize the theory and get a good understanding of where we want to be in the world and to build communities that thrive. So I think for me, it's less about the inequities because they're all there and they're in abundance. But I'm thinking when we talk about inequities, oftentimes the conversation doesn't follow the power. And I think it's important to think about when we talk about inequities, who has the power and how is it deployed in a way that can directly confront said inequities, right? Because we understand, right, racism, white supremacy, toxic masculinity, there's so many ways that we see as a culture individualism. There's so many ways that we see as a culture and the way that the Western society is built. There are a number of inequities, most of them on the backs of and resulted in the disenfranchisement of Black and Brown and Indigenous people. So I think to me that's clear, and there's so many ways that we can talk about that. Ableism is another big one. But again, when I think about inequities, yes, they're there, but how do we talk about power and putting power into the hands of the people who are directly facing those inequities every day in order for them to have the resources they need to develop a community in which they can thrive? So yes, inequity has a number of different faces, but we've spent so much time, I think, talking about that and highlighting that. And I think a lot of people on this call and on this panel knows what that looks like, right? In terms of class, in terms of race, we see that every day. And I think in this moment and stepping forward, I would really like to step forward into thinking what a liberated society could look like if we want it, Because I think, again, there's so many resources here that we're choosing not to deploy that it's tough to continue to talk about inequities, although that's a really good conversation to have. But this is why I'm so excited about the Stepping Forward program and a lot of the things that we're talking about here, because I want to start living in that world of love and start thinking about how we can reverse engineer that to get to there one day. And I think that should definitely start today.
So let's build off of that idea of sort of who has the power and how to sort of gain momentum off of what we saw protests and rallies across the state with Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd. Is the moment here to really begin to move forward and address systemic racial inequities and disparities that have also been brought to life by the COVID pandemic? And so I'm just curious, are you all optimistic right now that change is coming, or where are we in that conversation right now? I'll leave it to whoever wants to pick that one up. Do you want me to call on someone? Kalila, I see you unmuted.
It's like being in my class where I ask my students a question and they're like, not me, go to the next person. Thank you. One of the things that I think we have to be very clear about is that the moment to address these challenges wasn't because of an uprising in Minneapolis or in New Haven. The moment to address these challenges and how they shape structure dates back to 1619. So the question then becomes, how do you start where you are in order to do that? The things that makes me most optimistic about the possibility of harnessing this moment, not on our terms, but on the terms of the people who are demanding change, is to look at the role of young people who said young people get overlooked in every sector of this society, whether we're talking about business or education or health. And yet we know every major movement for change in this country and really across the world has been led by the energy, the enthusiasm of young people. And so the conversations that I've been having with the young people in my life, the young people in my neighborhood, the young people who are lifting their voices in new ways that are new to me as an older person, but not new to their generation, is to simply say, no longer, right? We will not accept the status quo. We will not accept being ignored based on our gender identity. We will not be ignored based on our status because someone paints them as a problem as opposed to potential. That's what makes me optimistic, and that's what gives me hope. It means something that today we learned that the Black Lives Matter movement, or the movement for Black lives, was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, not because that legitimates the work that they've been doing for a decade, but it means, again, that young people who get overlooked have the potential to raise our collective consciousness. And then the question, so that hope doesn't sort of die on the vine, but hope actually becomes meaningful, sustainable change, is whether we are willing to respect the power and agency of young people who are demanding that, and also being okay with being uncomfortable and not knowing all the answers. I think a lot of folks are trying their very best to do the best they can, but sometimes you don't know what you don't know.
You know, I would just add, I think what Kalila said is absolutely right. And it's something we think a lot about at the Community Foundation. To your question, Jackie, I would just add, am I optimistic? I guess I feel like this is, as I said in the outset, I feel like this is a moment when change is more possible than it's been. How far we will as a society take that, of course, remains to be seen. And stepping forward is an attempt by one institution to try to advance that. But I feel this is a moment where, a moment unlike where we've been, because the divisions in our society, the divisions around race, the divisions around ethnicity, the divisions around gender, the divisions that the oppression in our society was, I think, had come to be by so many people accepted as part of the status quo. And I think frankly, I think there's a very important political dimension to this in the political environment of the last 4 years. Where the President of the United States was doing everything he could to exacerbate these divisions, people who had come to accept them, whether they, even if they found them abhorrent, had come to accept them as part of the status quo, began to see them not as sustaining the status quo, but actually as threatening the status quo, because the whole system was being shaken from the foundations. And I think that's what we've seen in this country over the last 4 years. And I think you put COVID on top of that, and the appalling inequities that we see in health outcomes and education, and in so many other areas as a result of COVID, and the anti-Black violence that we saw in 2020 and the response to it, makes me feel that this is a moment unlike any we've seen in some time in this country.
I'd love to hear how we elevate voices that have been, sorry, Addis, go ahead. You were going to say something.
No, actually we'll speak just to what you're saying, the elevating the voices. I think we need to take this time right now to celebrate one thing, that the conversation has been shifted. As a result of the last 4 years, the conversation has been completely shifted. People can actually now say white supremacy without feeling like, oh my God, someone's gonna attack me, or they're not gonna believe me. Now that it's coming out of the mouths of white men in power, it is now, oh, well, maybe we need to do something about this. So the excitement that we're changing the conversation is at full front. I think where I am cautious and wanna remind folks is that it's organizing that's going to change the future. It is not going to be programs. It is not going to be service delivery. It's not going to be foundations. It is going to be the power of the people collectively using their collective power to change not just systems, but change policies. I think we're really excited in this moment that we have a change in the White House, but I am reminded about something often, and that is that the quiet before the storm. I remember how excited I was in 2000 when I first voted for president. And I went to bed and one person was elected, and I woke up the next morning and they stole the actual election. And here we are in 2008, it felt the same level of excitement. And in 2010, we were smacked in the face with an organized effort to undo that called the Tea Party. And here we are now, 2021, we're excited. Yeah, we have a Black woman in a position of authority. We have a new brigade in place, but we cannot afford to be ahistorical in this moment. And I think Dr. Brown said it best, like this didn't just start now. This has been for over 400 years. So let's not be short-sighted. The excitement is in the air. I'm just wondering, how do we keep it in the air so we don't go back to sleep? Because it's really easy to start celebrating and thinking that we're getting somewhere because the people who are in a position of power or authority are somewhat aligned with us. But the reality is nothing gets done by just changing law. It actually has to change in the practice in the community. So yes, I'm excited. And the only way that we're going to uplift the voices of people is to stop this notion of that we're empowering people to do stuff. We don't have any more power than other folks. What we need to be in the business of is making sure that people get a sense of the power that they have. And it just can't be about showing up to support community when they're in dire needs. It has to be something consistently being developed, cultivated, nurtured. I mean, we live in a city, which I hate. Every time somebody calls our city minority, majority minority, we are not the minority. Minority is a word that we need to start canceling. We are the global majority, one. Two, when we think of ourselves as minority, we're basically saying that we're less than. Why can't we just call that we have a multicultural city, which is what we have? It's a beautiful city. But until we start really respecting each other for who we are as we walk into these spaces, and also start changing the language by which we talk about our own community, we're going to continue to be in the same conversation 3 years later, 4 years later, 10 years later. At some point, it's going to be up to us to collectively organize with others in order to change this narrative.
I'd love to flesh out that idea a little bit more about the power of organizing and the value of service delivery as well, as far as how sort of next steps potentially and in moving forward the discussion. Anika, would you like to sort of take on sort of that question a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, power to all of the people is really what we're trying to aim for. And I think that's an important thing to say because, in my view of liberation is really everyone is at the table, everyone has power, and everyone's be able to deploy that power in order to create communities in which they can thrive. So I think going back to your question to see, what does that mean at the community organizing and in service of providing services and programs, if the services and programs are not steeped in the need of community and if folks aren't asking for it, then I don't really think it's worth putting together. I think there needs to be an opportunity to really center the voices and people who have proximate to the issues and probably have lived experience with the issues to say, hey, here's something I'm dealing with and here's the solution. And I think oftentimes there's an idea of people presenting a solution and then the organizations and governing bodies saying, well, that doesn't really align with XYZ, or that doesn't really, or do you really need just cash, right? All of those things where it's like, if you ask and people tell you what they need, I think it's really important for you to listen, especially if you're deploying finances, whatever type of capital, human capital, social capital, financial capital. And I think on the other side, in terms of community organizing, I'm really struck by this idea of a multicultural city and the opportunity and sheer intelligence and will and human power in this city to collectively come together. We've seen this happen all throughout last year and even before, time and time again, people come together and organizing. And we need institutions, if they really want to see people succeed, to provide operational support for individuals to continue to organize, right? Because again, it's not about just deploying finances, it's understanding and really changing the culture in which people interact and which people have the faith, the knowledge, and above all else, the power to do what they need to do in the city that they love. And obviously that's why they're still here. So I think, again, service needs to be, whatever service organizations are providing, it needs to be truly in service to community with no asterisk next to that. And I think the organizing should be front and center so that there's a clear pipeline and flow for all people to be successful in this city.
So we're getting a question from the audience on what would it take? They would like to see some guidance from the panel on actual tangible, actionable strategies that promote and infuse people of color in leadership and other roles, including any or all of the following: foundation executive boards, teachers, businesses, for-profits, the various roles, to make sure those voices are heard. Garrett, would you like to take that question?
Sure. I think it's creating, I'll use the word pipelines, but it's including more people. And let me just kind of answer to one of the previous questions. I'll come back to this. I mean, we saw in corporate America lots of money committed during last summer, but there weren't a lot of plans behind those dollars. And it's great to have the dollars out there, but now is the point in time, and if this change is really going to take that, there's plans behind that are really driven towards change, and they're detailed plans. But also, the infrastructure, you can't just all of a sudden infuse tons of money, and if there's not that infrastructure to make change, and so that money doesn't just flow to the same organizations, not that they're bad organizations, but to the same organizations that had the kind of same mindset, have not made real change or have not incorporated more people. So that's the real difficult moment that we're at in making that change, is that we empower other organizations, and that's why and I'll give credit to Howard Hill, who's vice chair of the chamber. I mean, he's been really clear with me and with our entire membership. The way that we're going to make change is not by the chamber being the one that's the leader, or say we're the leader. It's working with other organizations that are much better positioned, are much more focused, and have a clear-eyed view of how to make that change. And so the role we can play is as that collaborator and supporter. Another thing that I've noticed just in the last few months, though, that people are kind of throwing around their associations with those organizations that are on the ground. But to Oni's point, are you putting in the operational dollars that are going to allow them to do the work? Just saying you're affiliated with so-and-so group, that's really not real. That's not really making change. I mean, there's a big push right now, and it's an important push to make sure we get as many businesses to use PPP too, the Paycheck Protection Program. But it's not just going to come from working with other groups. I mean, that's there's a lot. The people who have not used that program, they have some hesitancy to it. They have some real issues as to why they think it won't work for them. And so it's really getting on the ground and talking with people. And then just to get back to the point of how do you get more people involved? I mean, you got to widen your lens as to who you're looking at for those positions. It's not the same group of people who end up serving on multiple boards. You got to look a level deeper, and maybe they don't have the same experiences that you have in the past expected. But you have to take a chance on people, because we know, because of the systematic racism that we have, that they may not have had all those same opportunities to have that same power-packed resume that the expectation may be.
So when it comes to next steps, how can different members of the community be supportive of one another, and how are folks to know that there's been progress made on this? What are some tangible sort of outcomes that you all would be looking for as success metrics?
So I'll jump in. A couple of things that I think are important there in terms of what's the strategy, what are the goals, and how do we measure that? It's easy to say that we're going to use data to do that and create a dashboard, and then we're going to measure how many businesses before, how many after. That's important. Data is important, but context is even more important. So what are the next steps that need to happen in order to actually step forward, being mindful of these structural challenges that have to be addressed? Because we are not going to program and grant make our way into an abundant region that so many of the other panelists have made. So what does that mean? It means that we know the businesses who were able to get access to those PPP loans were often the ones who already had a relationship with the financial institution or had an attorney on deck or an accountant that could help them navigate that process. So we created this fund to be able to support businesses, smaller businesses that are led by women, led by people of color, who traditionally get left out of those conversations. So by the time it makes it to the front page of the news, those decisions have often already been made. It means then that we have to have partnerships and collaborations. The partnership with the chamber or the partnership with the City of New Haven is one type of partnership. But again, the partnerships with those mutual aid organizations, with youth-led organizations and movements who traditionally would not be in conversation with a community foundation. And so part of breaking down those structural barriers also means that we cannot expect anything of others that we do not demand of ourselves. So that means doing the internal work. It means, as Will mentioned, new fundraising efforts to create this fund for equity and inviting donors to ask the tough questions. Where is this money going? How will that be distributed? And creating new models of community engagement and how some of those decisions are being made. We realize that there are a number of nonprofits who are saying, if you are stepping forward, does that mean that you are stepping away from us? And that is a question that we have to address, as Will and Nick mentioned. But it is also about asking ourselves, what is the expectation? And when I say ourselves, I mean the greater New Haven community broadly. Having new ways of doing business, not just as a foundation, but as a community. A lot of us have now realized that the way education was working in our region was not working for large groups of people. What is the innovation that can come out of this disruption? And that's what we do. And the last thing I'll say, because I see some of the comments about how do we diversify these spaces. A few years ago, re-entry became the buzzword that everybody jumped onto and threw it into their mission statement to make them eligible for something, right? It meant that they could get grants or for mentoring or something. Equity cannot be the new buzzword. It cannot be the next shiny thing that people run to. Instead, what we have to say is that every institution, every business, every organization needs to reflect the community, not that it serves, but that it works with. So that means creating pipelines so that if it is an organization whose board does not reflect the community, then how do we get a pipeline of people to serve on boards of various organizations and nonprofits? I'm a bit biased. I'm excited that the Community Foundation Board is one of the most diverse boards in our region, not for diversity's sake in terms of checking a box, but of bringing that experience and that connection. If that is what we expect of ourselves as a foundation, we have to expect that of others and also cultivate a process. So that when people are always coming to me and saying, I need to hire somebody or I need to appoint somebody, we can start having a pool of people that are not the same 4 people that we see every time. That's how you step forward in a meaningful, sustained way and do not see that responsibility to any one person. Because as Addis and Oni and others will tell you, at sometimes your shoulders get heavy and you feel like in order for me to keep doing the work, I need to see who else is doing it too.
Will, I'd like to turn a question to you. There was a question from the audience about what internal changes has the foundation made to ensure equity is within the structure and practices of its organization. What work remains to be done in that space?
Well, I think this has been a fundamental commitment of the Community Foundation for a long time, and in a very tangible and deliberate way for the last half dozen years or so. That is to say, focusing on our internal culture, focusing on equity, and elevating equity as core to what we envision we're trying to achieve in our community, to our mission, as I said before, to our strategic plan, as I said before, to our internal culture. So we have been working on these issues in any number of ways. It is the It is understanding the diversity of our community, understanding the diversity of our traditions, has been at the center of the cultural change we have been creating, tried to create and been creating in the Community Foundation, as I said, for a very long time, but in particular for the last half dozen years or so. And I think Stepping Forward reflects that, and the priorities of Stepping Forward in terms of supporting BIPOC-led organizations, in terms of supporting BIPOC-led small businesses, and developing an inclusive entrepreneurial culture in our community. In terms of the grant making we intend to do, and the organizing we intend to support, and the advocacy we intend to do around attacking racist systems and structures in our society, whether it's in healthcare or in education or in law enforcement or in housing or in economic opportunity. So this has become very central. This has become utterly central to who we are and what we do and what we aspire to do. Is there more to do? Of course, there's always much more to do. And we are working internally and trying to understand these changing dynamics externally and to respond to them. I want to also come back, Jackie, if I can, for 1 second to your question about metrics, and to Kalila's comments. I think the metrics conversation is very important. The community needs to make progress, and it needs to understand how it's making progress and whether it is. But I would back up from there and start with the basic proposition that, I mean, for the foundation, it's about, as I said before, equity and opportunity. We don't have community goals, widespread, broadly accepted community goals around creating greater opportunity in our community or creating greater equity in our community. We have lots of people working at these issues, but we really do need, I think, to establish a set of goals and work toward them, and have and broaden the base of people who are working and institutions that are working toward the achievement of goals in these areas. Once we've defined what we're trying to achieve, we're all smart enough to define metrics for measuring progress or lack of progress. And that's a very important thing to do. But unless our community comes together in ways we haven't in a very, very, very long time, and I've been in this community for a long time, unless we come together and prioritize, decide that these are our priorities, creating more opportunity for more of our residents, creating greater equity in our community, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen with the progress that we want to see, at the pace we want to see, and to achieve the community that we envision for the future.
I'm curious the role that the region plays in this. We've spent a lot of time talking about New Haven specifically, but what role do some of the suburbs play in this conversation? There was a question about how do the panelists imagine the entire region that the foundation represents fighting for racial justice. Many donors, for example, live in the segregated suburbs. What role should the suburbs be playing into this, or what role, sort of a more regional approach put into this? Marcella, we haven't heard from you in a while. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or Addis, would you like to?
Sure.
Addis can go first.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is that whenever we have this conversation about equity and changing racial dynamics, we seem to point it at the city. Guess what? Suburbs needs this conversation too, because racism lives in those communities too. And the more that we tend to focus on the communities of color and less on white communities, what ends up feeling is like the answer to fixing racism is to deal with people of color, when this is not just a people of color issue. This is an everybody issue. Everybody is responsible for how we're going to move forward. I find, as someone who's currently living in Hampden, I often feel like this conversation doesn't seem to happen enough in these spaces. And it would be in our best interest to find ways to not be so segregated in this conversation. But just like we're having this conversation here, talking about New Haven, who's having the conversation in Hampden and Seymour and Sonia or wherever else to speak about what that racial inequality looks like there? The other piece I would add, if we're talking about where do we go from here, people need to stop looking at this as a transactional change that we're in right now. Because usually when we're doing transactional change, we'll immediately hire someone, we'll create a whole department to deal with it, we'll have some new programs around funding, but we'll even change our constituency. As Dr. Brown actually pointed out, I was part of that movement in 2007 when everybody was talking about reentry. And I remember vividly working at Project More and doing that work. And Project More had been doing that work for over 35 years. But suddenly the end thing was reentry. And now everybody in the city was doing reentry services. None of it which was coordinated, none of which would actually made the kind of impact it could have had, because then we started to compete with each other for dollars as opposed to working together towards a solution. So even as we're talking about this now about racial equity, it's important for us to actually move from the transactional to the actual transformative. And that's looking at mission statements. How are people actually embedding this into the fabric of the work that they're doing, whether you're a foundation, a nonprofit, or a for-profit? The other piece is also, how are you embedding this in your policies and practices? It's not enough for us to get a diverse workforce or tokenize some people to come into our board of directors, because guess what? If the culture and the policies and practices that are in place are still operating under racist practices and white supremacy, you're just gonna end up completely burning out those people who do come to the table to do the work with you. It's not enough to just diversify the issue. This is not about multicultural racism. We can still have a diverse party and still be operating under racist structures. It's really important for us to actually take this time and build relationships where we're actually accountable. Not accountable meaning that, oh, well, you know, we punish each other for what's not being done, but accountable meaning that we have mutual agreed upon agreements as to how we're going to show up for each other and do this work. It excites me that we even are having this conversation, but I would really think that this conversation just can't be living in New Haven. It needs to be flourishing in every single community that the foundation is doing this work in.
Marcella, 3 years from now, how will we know that this conversation wasn't just a conversation and actually more would change? And are we missing people from this conversation to make sure that more voices are being elevated in this space?
You know, these kinds of, if we call them courageous, necessary conversations we need to have, right? And have in groups and between groups, and let this not be the last one. And I mean, I think kind of as I am sort of very just riveted and inspired, right, by what I'm hearing today. But for me, what is highly motivating is, where is that policy, right? Where are those policy levers for us to actually sustain, right? Like, if we're going to meet this moment and it will last, then I think we have to have some really deep conversations around what are the policies that got us here. And we've talked a lot about kind of the root of the policies, but the policies that have gotten us here and what we need to do to not just disrupt, right, but transform, to elevate, to renew, like all of that work we need to do in a policy space. And I think that is our pathway to getting from having conversations and discourse into sustained action over time. Absolutely, to the point of who's not here. Lots of people are not here, right? I mean, this is at the core of the work, is building those relationships and those partnerships, as we've been discussing tonight. So I think that is a key piece for next step work, is figuring out like all these concentric circles, of who, is Shirley Chisholm, right? If you're not invited to the table, like, bring a folding chair, right? So like, everybody needs to like bring that folding chair to this work now. And that can be one of our most instrumental next steps.
The last question is for Will. With this Stepping Forwards grant and initiative, how do you hope moving forward that grant and that infusion of resources will have lasting impacts? How will this be different than all other grants that have been done by? Or is that the intent, for it to be sort of a different model going forward under this?
Well, I think it is a different model in the sense, as I've said, and as we've talked about in this conversation, and as other panelists have clearly said and underscored, that we need to bring different people to the table, different institutional dynamics to the table, and focus on issues that perhaps have been focused on not enough in our community over time. I think that stepping forward, we see as this additional spending over 3 years, but of course these issues are not, as a number of people have said, are not 3-year issues. I hope that what we will see over the next several years is our community coming together in ways that don't happen enough. And I hope we can make a contribution to that, but it isn't up to the Community Foundation to do that or to deliver that, far from it. I hope this community will come together around creating greater opportunity and creating greater equity and dealing with the terrible impacts of COVID and the opportunity to advance racial equity as the key steps, the key things that need to happen right now to create a community that ultimately is creating greater opportunity for more people and is more equitable in every way. And so, that's what this is about. And I think it does require different dynamics, different relationships in many of the ways we've heard about tonight. And it requires more resources too, given the scale of the challenges that we have and the scale of the opportunities that we have. And that's why we're stepping forward with more resources and with a different way of doing our work. And we hope that we will partner with so many others in the community, many people who we've heard from tonight, and many, many others, because that's critical to getting this work done.
And with that, I want to thank everyone for being here this evening for advancing opportunity and equity during COVID.